Why did Belarus help Russia invade Ukraine? Well, we've been watching the conflict as it unfolds, and as Russia invades Ukraine, Belarus keeps popping up, and it seems as though the country is almost helping facilitate this Russian invasion. Considering how the rest of the world has been quick to condemn the invasion and has begun imposing harsh sanctions, it appears as though Belarus is only going further to help Russia, and this leads us to the question of why. Belarus is a landlocked country in Eastern Europe, and it is surrounded by Russia to the east and northeast, Ukraine to the south, Poland to the west, and Lithuania and Latvia to the northwest. Belarus, similar to Ukraine, has been in Vladimir Putin's sights for long before this invasion began. Both Ukraine and Belarus are former Soviet republics turned independent countries, and Putin believes that they were unfairly separated from Russia after the fall of the Soviet Union. He claims them to be an important part of Russian history and land, and while that may or may not be true, this shouldn't change or have any effect on their right to be independent and sovereign nations, should they choose to be such. Since 1994, Belarus has been ruled by an authoritarian named Alexander Lukashenko, and it is said that throughout his rule he's been able to keep a pretty decent balance on things, sort of like a neutrality in the country, or at least as it appeared on the outside, which is exactly why, back in 2014, while Russia was annexing Crimea, the peace talks over this first invasion of Ukraine were held in the capital of Belarus, Minsk. It is thought that Putin has similar ideas for Belarus as he does very clearly for Ukraine, but it is thought that while the path to procure Ukraine has been anything but gentle or subtle, the path to procure Belarus is a much more soft approach. Many Russian oligarchs were able to buy up some very key pieces of the Belarusian economy, which is one way to show their dominance over the country, and all the while, Russia has been placing pressure on the country to export goods through their ports. While this is all interesting, it doesn't yet answer our question of why Belarus is helping Russia. The answer to this main question really stems back to 2020. In this year, there was an election that was held in Belarus, who, like I previously mentioned, has been under the authoritarian Lukashenko. In this election, there was a popular candidate who ended up being jailed, and this led to his wife Svetlana Tsikhanouskaya, who is a former English teacher and homemaker, to bravely step up and run in his place. Many people believed that the results of the election saw her winning. I mean, it is said that this idea is drawn from exit polls and election monitors, but despite what people believed, the outcome of the election was the same as it had been for the last 26 years. This led to the generation of people who were tired of this government, who want something more and different for the country, and who were tired of the Soviet-style rules to rebel against this alleged election rigging. This led to protests that involved hundreds of thousands of citizens, and when Lukashenko saw that his position was at stake, he turned to who? Well, none other than Putin himself. The Russian leader helped bail him out of this spot by giving him his full political and economic support. Putin helped the Belarusian economy, and he made it crystal clear just how he'd oppose any effort to democratize the country. This is what put Lukashenko in a position where he simply could not refuse the entry of 30,000 Russian troops to the borders of Ukraine. And he also couldn't say no to the joint exercises between Russian and Belarusian troops, which were obviously in preparation for the Ukraine invasion. I mean, he could have, but with his approval rating sitting at a low 25%, he has to depend on this backing for his survival. Over the last 20 months, Lukashenko and Putin have met regularly so that he could deliver reports on the state of affairs within Belarus. It is important to note that one of the largest problems that Lukashenko and his regime face is the Belarusian economy, which has an unsustainable amount of foreign debt. After the violence seen and in the aftermath of the protests we just talked about, the Western sanctions implemented meant that Belarus wasn't able to raise money on international markets. This year, Belarus has to repay over $3.3 billion in foreign debt, and they are hoping for a loan from Russia in order to do that. Belarus is important for Putin for this invasion because the Belarusian border lies extremely close to the Ukrainian capital of Kyiv. At this point in time, while prior to this Lukashenko was saying the direct opposite, Belarusian troops are now appearing to join in with Russia in behind the invasion. It is expected that Russian troops will remain in Belarus and that Russia will establish bases in the country, and to make matters even worse, Lukashenko has pushed through a referendum that renounces Belarus' non-nuclear status. This status was first agreed to when the country gave up its Soviet-era nuclear weapons in 1994, but with this referendum, that might mean that Russia is moving nuclear weapons into Belarus. This is dangerous, of course, for Ukraine, but it also threatens the NATO countries that border Belarus, Poland, and Lithuania. This also means that Lithuania and the other two Baltic states, Latvia and Estonia, are almost cut off by Russian-controlled territory from other NATO countries, and that they are connected only by a 60-mile strip of border with Poland known as the Suwalki Gap. This means that should we get confirmation of this, other members of the NATO alliance might need to begin doing more in order to defend these at-risk countries, and who knows what implications that may have. On February 28th, there were reports that peace talks between Ukraine and Russia were happening in Belarus, and with everything I just explained, many people were confused as to why. That's a super reasonable question, but as it turns out, they weren't. Ukraine turned down Russia's first proposal to have the talks held in Minsk because, well, like anyone in their right mind, Ukraine was worried that their delegation would not return alive. This led to the talks being held on the border of Ukraine and Belarus after assurances from Lukashenko that the Ukrainian representative would remain safe. Ukrainian President Zelensky had suggested other locations, but Russia refused them all, which only drives home just how important Belarus is to Russia during this invasion. To end off this video today, we've discussed why Belarus is aiding Russia in this conflict. We understand the economic reasoning behind it all, but let's talk about why it no longer makes sense. Earlier in February, the Eurasian Fund for Stabilization and Development, which for the record is Russia-led, refused a $3.5 billion loan to Belarus. Okay, not exactly helpful to the economy that's struggling, but while doing this, the Kremlin did promise to consider refinancing $1 billion in Belarusian debt to Moscow. Okay, maybe a little more helpful, but promises don't mean too much in the economic world, and that promise came before the harsh sanctions were placed on Russia. The sanctions Russia is seeing from the West as a result of their illegal invasion truly are unprecedented, and because of how harsh they are, it is highly likely that this will greatly impede their ability to follow through on this promise. Right now, it is thought that Belarus has $8.5 billion in gold and foreign currency reserves, which will help for now, but certainly not forever. The sanctions don't just stop there, however. Lithuania and Ukraine had previously, as a result of the post-election turmoil, placed a ban on transit through their ports of Belarusian potash, which is a fertilizer ingredient and is a very important part of export for Belarus. Russia had of course offered to help, but now its seaports are lacking the extra capacity to handle these exports, which could end up costing Belarus $1 billion in annual revenue should they fail to find an appropriate alternative. This all goes to show that while it is said that Lukashenko is the leader of Belarus, it might not be all that clear-cut. It's entirely possible that he didn't even know in advance of the Russian invasion into Ukraine, especially considering how, for weeks before the war began, there were some things that could be seen as attempts to get away from the position Russia was holding. It is becoming increasingly clear that he might not be so directly involved in these decisions. The outcome of the war in Ukraine could have some grave consequences for Belarus, and you would think, especially considering how hard he held on to the position of power that the people of his country clearly didn't want him to have, that he would be strongly opposed to basically being treated like a puppet for Russia. Despite what is happening in terms of leadership, it appears as though the people of Belarus aren't quite on board with what's happening either. Not only are the pressure of the sanctions being felt by the public, but they are being forced to go against their traditional mental state of neutrality in support of this invasion. It will be interesting to see exactly what happens as Belarus continues to feel the weight of the sanctions imposed upon them.